Welcome back. And today's class will focus on the topic of crypto arts curation. This is actually the first class for our brand new mentor, Stina Gustavsson. Correct me if I, say your name wrong. And she's a creative strategist and curator working with companies and organizations in arts and culture. And yeah, I'll hand it over to her now. And yeah, enjoy the class.
Thank you so much. And you pronounced my name absolutely perfect. So let me just share my screen. Oh, no, sorry. That's the one I wanted. So first and foremost, thank you so much to Vertical Crypto and the team for inviting me. As Matilda mentioned, I am here today to talk a bit more about what curation might mean when it comes to crypto art, NFTs, Web3, and so on. But before I start, I'm just going to introduce myself a bit. I'm Stina Gustavsson. I am an independent curator and art strategist. I'm currently based in Copenhagen. I studied communication, criticism, and curation, arts and design at Central St. Martin's in London, and I majored in flux and future thinking in public art practices. So I originally worked in the more traditional art world and art market, and I had all kinds of roles, but I've always had my curatorial practice on the side. And in 2018, I first started to work with the Department of Decentralization, which is a Berlin-based blockchain foundation. In 2019, I co-founded their art department, which I now also run. We exist very much within the intersection of art and tech. We usually say that we speak both languages. So that means that we speak the language of a more traditional art world, but also the language that is more suited for the tech-heavier audiences. We have released 2 full-length reports on the topic of art and blockchain. The first one was released in June in 2019, and it was called There is No Such Thing as Blockchain Art, and it was covering the intersection of blockchain and art back in 2019. We got a lot of pushback on the title because people thought that we literally meant that there was no such thing as blockchain art. But of course, we were being ironic. That's usually the take we have with most of the things we do. This report has also been referred to as one of the 2 key publications exploring blockchain's possibilities and limitations across varied cultural domains. The second one was released in February 2021, and it was called Wanderer Above a Sea of FUD, Cultural Workforce, Crypto-Anarchism, Intellectual Rights, and Blockchain-Based Funding Models for Cultural and Arts. So this one was quite a lot more narrow than the first one. And both these reports has been extremely fruitful for us and has allowed us to start collaborations with artists such as Hito Steyrel, which we have a big presentation with next Wednesday, and also conversations with organizations such as Rhizome, etc. Besides the work I do for my clients and for DoD, I also currently research locational identity online and how this is being portrayed within public art online. Public art is already a very complex subject in today's society as it's constant in flux. And I think as we are moving online, more and more borders are being erased. And though this is usually a good thing, I think it also leads to potential further complexity of the subject, such as locational identity and how that affects public art. But I'm here today to speak about curation and what perhaps that might mean when it comes to Web3, crypto, blockchain, and so on. But before we go into that, I think it's very important to look at where curation comes from, the meaning of the word, the role of the curator from a more traditional approach, and so on, to learn and reflect upon what that might mean in our industry, the Web3 industry. You might have already gone through this and know all about this, but I think maybe sometimes it's good with repetition. So the word curation stems from the Latin word cura, which directly translates to care and concern. It's also the name of the Roman goddess who created the first human. Cura is mentioned in Hyginus' work A Fable, poem 220. So I'm just going to read a bit here, which I think is interesting. In crossing a river, Cura gathered clay and engrossed in thought, being to mold it. When she was thinking about what she already made, Jove arrived on the scene. Cura asked him to grant it spiritus, breath, or spirit. He grants her request readily, but when she also asks to give her creation her own name, he forbade it, insisting that he had to carry his name. While the two were arguing, Tellus arose and wanted to have her name because she had made her body available for it. The judgment is finally rendered by Saturn. He determines that since the spiritus was granted by Jove, he should have it in death. Tellus, or Earth, should receive the body she had given because Cura, or Care, had been the curator. She would keep her creation as long as it lived. So basically, this is the story of Cura. So it's very much about the care and the concern, which I think is extremely interesting when you're thinking about the word curation. The poem first got the attention of the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. He stated that the double sense of cura refers to care for something as concern, absorption of the world, but also care in the sense of devotion. I think this is a very interesting quote, as I think curation as a whole is really something that depends on what he mentions here: concern, absorption, and devotion. Heidegger's concept here is, of course, much more complex, but we can save that for another discussion. So to move just forward to the 1960s, when the modern idea of the role of the curator was starting to shape up, we have a few prominent curators back then, who I believe are important in terms of the role as it is today, such as Clement Greenberg. The scope of the role back then widened, though care and concern was still a part. The role of the curator became also about translation, conceptualization, ideation, recognition, interpretation, education, evaluation, and so on. So for me, it's very much about understanding why and how. Not only maybe what an art piece or how an art piece is made, but also why and how it fits within the current situation. Why this might be important for the future, why it might be important from an educational point of view, why this is pushing the narrative forward, how this might reflect upon history and also fit within the narrative of history, how this might help other within the practices, and also how this might challenge current views. So Web3 curation then, what does that even mean, and is it actually different from any other type of curation? I know that this is something that you have very much covered before, but I think it's always important to mention these things so that we can make sure that we're on the same page. So when I talk about Web3, I'm talking about the decentralized internet. So we know that we have the first internet, which was Web1, the internet that we have now, which has great reach. It's Web2, which includes big tech such as Facebook, Google, basically a centralized internet. Web3 is the next internet, which is also what we're working with. It's the next new iteration, and if everything goes to plan, it will also be decentralized. This means that there won't be a few companies that owns it, but the ownership will be distributed. As I said before, I know that you know this already, but just to make sure that we're on the same page. So when people say Web3 curation, you usually associate it with decentralized curation. It could, of course, be this, but I personally think that it's much more than this. I have gone through several processes of decentralized curation. I don't think it's very easy, to be honest. I find that it usually means that previous expertise, research, and knowledge is not recognized as you are all on the same level. No hierarchy is usually great, but in certain cases, it's also not, because it undermines skills, and skills might be written off as something that's less important, just to make sure that you are on the same level and have an equal say. So what do I think then? Well, what do I think of when I then say Web3 curation of crypto, curation of NFTs, or just curation in general, I guess? So as we move forward with the role of the curator in Web3, there are a few areas which I think are becoming more and more important. They are preservation, reflection, and long-term thinking. I think these three are absolute core. So covering preservation first. So the titles you see here are, I don't think it's this week's, but last week's recommended NFT drops by NFT Now. This is by all means no any art NFTs, but just to give you an idea. So I actually have no clue of the quality of these ones, but this is just to give an example. These are just the recommended ones, so we can only imagine how much white noise that's actually being released and created just within that week. And this, of course, also doesn't cover the constant release of art NFTs that's also happening across platforms such as Object, Super Rare, Known Origin, Foundation, and all the others. And within this white noise, of course, recommended by NFT or any art NFT or any other NFT for that matter, there are definitely good projects and pieces. But of course, with this much going on, there's a huge risk that projects of high quality won't be seen, recognized, remembered, heard, won't reach the public, basically. Things are being forgotten quite quickly due to the high turnaround of projects. And with so much happening all the time, it's very easy to also not consider what we actually don't want to preserve for the future. What will be remembered in the future and how it will be remembered are questions that I feel we are currently forgetting to ask ourselves from time to time. So the role of the curator here, as I see it, is actually not too dissimilar from what the role is outside Web3. To be able to identify, to be able to argue for the quality or importance of a piece, to be able to present and talk about it in a way that allows for the art and the project to also take a step above that white noise. And as for curators, I think maybe we have the privilege of time here. This is our work. So, I mean, one can only hope that we use that time in the right way. That is researching, understanding, supporting projects and pieces that are valuable. And before I move on to the next slide, I just want to say that I think that this is something that Vertical Crypto does extremely well. So I just want to give kudos to the whole Vertical Crypto team for doing this work. So in terms of reflection and long-term thinking, two terms that goes hand in hand for me. And I also think that these two are both getting increasingly important as we move forward within an existence online. What I mean with this is that we need to reflect on history to be able to implement long-term thinking for more sustainable futures. Web3 is quite quick sometimes with claiming that what is currently being created is better than what we've had so far and what we currently have. And I think this is perfectly fine to claim this if you know the history and if you're able to reflect upon previous mistakes, previous learnings, failures, wins, systems, etc. If you don't necessarily have the capability or don't necessarily have the knowledge to do this, I think it sometimes can be hard to claim that what's being created is better because you might not be able to compare it to history. And this is also where the curator comes in for me. as maybe some kind of a guide in terms of previous art worlds systems, as someone that can reflect upon what it means to create systems that might be better not only for the artists and the creators, but also for the bigger art ecosystem. This, of course, ties directly into long-term thinking and planning for something bigger in the future. If you know the history, then perhaps it's easier for you to take into consideration when it comes to thinking about strategies for more sustainable systems. And again, I want to emphasize on creating these systems for the wider art ecosystem, something that goes beyond the artist and creator and considers the wider cultural workforce. The current narrative that we see within the Web3 system is that everyone can be a curator. And by all means, I mean, yes, of course we can. But also, I want to say that what I said is that the curator role is much wider. And if we're talking solely about putting art pieces together, then maybe curation isn't the right word. Maybe collection builder or something along those lines might be more suitable. I think maybe as we move forward, the role of the curator, as I see it, will be recognized as a wider role, to tie it back to what I said before, especially when it comes to new territories such as the metaverse and Web3. There's a lot of translation that needs to happen, and curators can help to facilitate innovation that is considerate of the history of the art world and the audiences that we are catering to, and also potentially implement these new technologies within existing art communities. I see the curator as not only an exhibition facilitator, a content maker or connection maker, but also more of a guide that can help to steer these new systems together with artists and others, of course. I mean, we're all extremely important within this space. And hopefully, together, we can maybe find a more sustainable innovation that supports bigger ecosystem and not just the individual. So to quote the Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire, I think this quote is very suitable. And I know he was not necessarily referring to curation with this role, but rather about building new systems for the oppressed, which by all means maybe is actually quite suiting for what we're trying to do. So it says, discovery cannot be purely intellectual, but must involve action, nor can it be limited to mere activism, but must include serious reflection. Only then will it be a praxis. So curation, again, is not a simple streamlined practice of selecting and organizing. Not now, or it wasn't really ever, but it's actually rather a complex one that is certainly evolving as we're speaking. I think context, activism, and reflection are hugely important and something that the curator needs to be aware of. And I actually do think that this is even more important for curators in Web3, crypto and blockchain, and so on. We all, we all need to know how to communicate what we have inside the industry. So thinking about URL versus IRL, what differences do we have and what might we need to consider? So I'm bringing now in exhibition design and exhibition thinking here as well, because of course this is still a very big part of being a curator. I also want to touch upon something that is more called like the outcomes of it and what that might be mean for a curator. I think until recently, we are in very interesting times right now, because until quite recently, the existence of our community, the Web3 community, was mainly online. COVID is, of course, one of the factors. We couldn't actually meet in person because of the situation. So I mean, it was just very natural that we stay there. Also, the industry is natively digital, so we have already huge crowd that is very comfortable with spending their time on the internet. So basically, being online is nothing new, but rather an extension of our life as we live it. I think that applies to everyone, but very specifically to the Web person and the people who are working with it. So before anything, I also think it's important to say that new media and digital art exhibitions online and on the web is actually nothing new, and it has a very rich history and practice, and it needs to be acknowledged. So even just across the bridge here in Copenhagen, in the Swedish area called Skåne, we have an extremely rich history of digital art with pioneers such as Charlotte Johannesson. She was born in 1943 in Malmö, Sweden, and she's still a practicing artist. She is also included in this year's iteration of the Venice Biennale, so that's super exciting to see her work in it. So she originally worked with weaving, but in 1978 she changed her loom to an Apple II Plus and basically taught herself coding and moved from making tapestry into digitally weaved imagery instead. The images that you see here are from her solo exhibition in Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid, in Spain last year. Skåne also had an electronic art festival called Electrohype, and it was solely dedicated to digital and electronic art. It ran for about 20 years, I believe, from the 1990s to the early 2000s. But unfortunately, they had to shut down, so we don't have this festival any longer. But they were extremely forward-thinking in terms of pushing installations, bringing electric and digital art audiences who might not be used to seeing it, and presenting it within settings where you would normally see other art. So basically setting it up in art museums. This is also an installation from that one of the festivals. This installation is from a piece called Semiotic Investigation into Cybernetic Behavior Description by artist Jessica Field. So this is also one of the pieces that was presented during one of their festivals. So to bring it back to where we are now, and maybe how we need to consider what we need to consider when we're building and planning exhibitions from more of an exhibition point of view or an exhibition design point of view. I think we need to go beyond the screens, even though that is the very natural view or the very natural technology to go for. By all means, the screens are the tool that we use to facilitate art, but the exhibitions themselves needs to build more around the narrative, and that is the narrative that is reaching beyond the screens. So to give you an example of what I mean by that, this is from an exhibition at ACA, which is the Australian Centre of Contemporary Art in Melbourne. I saw this exhibition in January, and it's called Who is Afraid of Public Space? It's about the new phase of public art in Australia and how public art could exist within the dialogue of the very problematic history that Australia has, at the same time as it opens up for also new dialogues and new narratives around Australia's contemporary history. This particular section of the exhibition that you see here was called Project Space The Hoarding, and it was realized by an agency called Sibling Architecture. What I find really fascinating with this is the use of material, and that the way that the digital pieces and the narrative is just actually echoed and emphasized by the space that has been created around them. Screens by all means, but this is also, if we go very screen heavy, it sometimes becomes very static. And I think if you create spaces like this, there is a bit more flow to it. Interestingly enough as well, it's really funny how they again echo the theme of the exhibition. A lot of the pieces here that you see actually refers straight back to the development places in Australia, and basically any Australian who goes into this space recognizes the material, sees so much about it, and kind of draws even more information in to put also themselves within the exhibition. So I have to just bring this word up. I absolutely kind of hate it, but I still need to bring it up. Phygital. Basically, it's a concept of using technology to bridge the digital world with the physical world. I mean, we do need both elements as we're moving into exhibiting digital art within the physical world. And I think maybe that the last slide shows where we might want to go. So basically what I want to point out with that image from the previous slide is the story, is the narrative that's being presented. It's not only about the pieces, but it's very much about the narrative. The exhibition was about something very like materialistic, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn from it and maybe consider it as we also move forward within our exhibitions in the real world. Like what I want to point out here is that we kind of need to like think about it again. I want to tie it back to Web3 curation and very specifically about reflection. Reflecting and understanding is so incredibly important. And we also need to get better at that as we move forward, I think, to be able to tell our narrative in ways that engage audiences. So yeah, reflecting and understanding is so incredibly important, and we need, as I said, we just need to get better at it. I think a good way of doing it is to know the history and to have the conversations both with artists, of course, but also within our case with technologists and developers. I think basically we are at a place where learning is still extremely important, and not just learning from people who's been in the industry for a long time, but also learning from everyone. Basically, learn from the technologists, learn from the developers, learn from the artists, and have those conversations to be able to create an understanding. So I also briefly want to touch upon something that I find absolutely fascinating and so extremely interesting, which again ties back into exhibition and exhibition design. That is experimental layouts versus more traditional layouts online, or more accurately in the metaverse. So I'm looking. So for this, I'm looking a bit more at the current narrative, a bit more specifically at exhibitions layout within the recent iterations of metaverse, as that is very relevant for Web3. I'm not going to go into places such as Second Life, etc., just as a small FYI. But quite early on in the pandemic, we did see some slight experimentation when it came to showing art online. New Art City popped up, and they offered some exhibitions that took a step away from the very conventional layout, from the more traditional, that is basically a web page setup or a room layout. One of those examples was Eat Me by Alice Yuan-Chang. This exhibition was more like a travel, a movement through a red room or a red void. It was as if you were floating in thin air whilst someone read out the directions, such as the one that you can see here in the image, which says, "There is nothing you need to do in this very moment, including moving through space." You simply went along for the ride. This exhibition is still up if you want to visit it and enjoy the ride. The website address is newart.city, and then you just need to scroll down the page until you find Eat Me by Alice Yuan-Chang. I think this is one of the better experimentations, as it didn't really allow you to move around in the space, which is also one of the problems that I see. You easily get disoriented. And that is, of course, something that we need to consider as we want to try to reach wider audiences online. But also, as we moved further into the metaverse, we saw more traditional recreations of spaces, elements that we're familiar with. We saw walls, floors, windows, doors. We even saw the white cube being presented again. So I just want to bring up some examples. I know that you've had lectures by Colben and Shivani from Museum of Crypto Art. They have, as you already know, their space in Somnium Space. And I have to say that this is actually one of the more experimental ones that we have out there. As you can see, there's no walls. The art appears to be hanging in thin air. There's also quite a few architectural features, which I'm pretty sure would be impossible to recreate in real life. But I also just want to point out that this is not in a negative way at all, but it's still like quite a traditional layout. You still have the floor, you still have the like invisible vertical walls, etc., etc. But I mean, yeah, that's completely fine. So why is this then? Why do we see a more traditional approach when it comes to showing art in the metaverse? There are a few reasons for that. So I was having a conversation with Michelle Cortese, which is a metaverse expert, and these are some of the things that she brought up. Onboarding is extremely important here. If we create spaces that people are able to recognize, it is actually more likely that they might want to join as they see something that they are familiar with. And it will, to put it frankly, be less scary and as a result also easier for them. I do think this is super important to remember because we are talking about wider reach, wider audiences quite often. And if we do that, we also should practice that as we preach. That is, of course, being mindful of these new audiences that we bring in. Another thing that I also find so extremely interesting is that traditional layouts is an indication of social values and accepted behavior. If spaces looks like real life, then that must mean that also that is the way that you should behave. We all know that humans and people have quite a hard time to behave properly online. So actually implying that social values are there by design, maybe that will just make it a bit easier. Maybe, or not easier, but maybe that will just open up for a less crap behavior, so to say. I also think that these structures that we see that imitates these real life museum indicates that these spaces are exactly that they are museums, but in the metaverse. It indicates that these ones are the new big players, that these are the museums of the future, and that they are by all means exactly on the same level as the museums that we see in real life. Another thing that we have as well is, of course, the limited imagination of a human being. Very few of us are actually capable of coming up with completely new things that aren't affected by the world that we affected by the scenario that we live in. And if you think about it, if you like try to come up with something completely crazy that you think maybe that you haven't seen before, most likely in many cases there will be elements that are directly tied to the physical world. And I mean, it's completely fine. That's a part of being a human, to have limitations. And I think that's also one of the beauties of being a human, because having and acknowledging your limitations also open up for collaborations and learning processes from other ones. So I'm just going to circle back now a bit to the notion and the idea of the curator and curation. So where are we now and where might we be going? I think we're getting to a point where reflection and long-term thinking needs to be two things that we basically do by default. It needs to be there, present in everything we do. I think if we're building something that's going to last for a long time, we need to go beyond the blind innovation. We need to go beyond the blind minting. We need to go beyond all of that. Basically, last year, we saw endless projects, endless minting, very little consideration, quite a lot of blind innovation, solutionism without conversations. This might be super exciting for a short time, but surely this is not helping us in terms of building new systems that's going to last beyond tomorrow. We need to just go beyond the excitement sometimes and just really think through what's going on here. So if we are serious about this industry as a whole, then reflection, translation, consideration, contextualization, long-term thinking will be key to create foundations that the whole ecosystem can grow and flourish on. So where does the curator fit in when it comes to this narrative then? To bring it back where I started with the word curation comes from the meaning of care and concern. The care and concern we are talking about now is not only a simple act of caring, though caring, I have to say caring is not always simple, but I think we also need to see it as a much wider term. The act of caring is there, but I think it means more than ever the act of reflecting, the act of translating, the act of contextualizing, the act of long-term thinking, the act of facilitating, the act of considering, the act of anything else. And that was my presentation. And yeah, any questions, please shout out.
Uh,
Silence.
oh, hello?
Hello.
Oh, right. I was actually I was curious about like how do artists sort of navigate the space where like you know you were talking about curation, but how do we navigate the space where there is sort of the lack of certain curation um to the detriment of the platforms themselves? Like the biggest example I can use is like for example like foundation allowing us to use tags like African art and Egyptian art, but you're still unable to search to search them directly within the platform and amongst things like that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great question. I think, and it was a very hard question to answer. To be completely honest, I think this is also where curators like myself also come in. That where we get more and more important to go through and to help people like yourself to go beyond that white noise. I think this is also why I am hesitant to use the word curation to certain platforms that's being curated or created right now, because I think that's not curation, because it's just an organizing mechanism, but actually not helping artists like yourself in terms of rising up, finding the right audiences, ending up within the right place. So yeah, I think I don't know if that's really answering your question. I think it's more kind of giving a bit more context to why curators are extremely important within the space. Yeah, I think that might be the best answer I might be able to give you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Claudia here. Thank you so much for that presentation. I found, like, when I first entered the space in 2020, there was not a lot of discussion on curation in Web3 at all. So I'm super happy to see so much more discourse happening here about that. I just had a question, and it's something I'm struggling with about curation in regards to for-profit marketplaces. Like Super Rare, like Foundation, although Foundation is invite only, but I guess the marketplaces that are invite only through the lens of like a curator bringing artists in, but looking at the data of artists, like, how much are they selling? What is their following like more so how profitable these artists are versus like the actual context of the work that they're bringing to the platforms. And so I find myself struggling between like how are these platforms really caring about curation when what I'm seeing a lot of is like a very sales focused curation strategy, right? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
I think, yeah, I think again, this is like, of course, I mean, like if you're looking at curation within commercial galleries, of course, that's very, depending on which gallery you are with, it could be very sales oriented or always sales oriented, but less focus on that. But I'm not necessarily sure if, again, this is like the curation is the right word. I again would probably go back to saying that this is for me more of a selection process rather than anything else. this is so, yeah, I don't like, I'm getting quite protective with the word curation, I'm realizing, but I think that's also because I get a lot when you say that you're a curator, it associates with a selection process, which it is not. So my thoughts upon that is that I think the word is being used way too easy within our industry, and it's being overused way too easy. And frankly, majority of the times where it's being used, for me, it's not curation, it's a selection process, and that's what it is.
I completely agree with that, Stina.
Yeah, thank you. I just as a add on to that, I agree, and I find it frustrating, to see this word curation being thrown around sometimes in like not even just platform specific, but like maybe some shows or exhibitions or like IRL events that are happening, when a lot of the time it's for engagement or like quote unquote clout. So it's I struggle with kind of like navigating that and just seeing it.
100% agree. I mean, it's like curation all of a sudden just became like a hip word that was used everywhere. I mean, I saw a thing on Instagram where it was like curate your cleaning services. I mean, come on, guys, this is just like turning into an absolute ridiculous thing. If you're like saying that you're curating cleaning services, I don't know, maybe not. But I mean, it's also not necessarily anything new if you think about it. I mean, when Instagram came, all of a sudden everyone was a photographer, and then also very much with the introduction of the creator economy and some of the platforms early on, everyone was a curator. Everyone was an artist, and I mean now all of a sudden curation has become something that's very, very important, and then all of a sudden everyone is a curator. So I mean, it's happening over and over again, just with different terms. But I think also like photographers had the right to say, actually, maybe not everyone is a photographer, and I think by all means artists have the right to say not everyone is an artist, but because God knows not everyone is an artist. And I think also curators like myself and other like practitioners within that has that role or call themselves that, maybe also should have the right to say, do you know what, maybe what you're doing isn't curation. That is completely fine, because not everyone should be a curator, but maybe that's also not the word that you should use for your service, for the description, for your exhibition, and so on.
What would you say is the way forward there? Because yeah, this is echoing a lot of thoughts that I've had too, where everyone's a DJ, everyone's a photographer, and I think there's something to be said about this just evolution of the human language, that the term curation may be drifting away, or its meaning may just be evolving. Is there, and I'm guessing here, but I think a lot of the time when people tell another person, no, you can't use this word, or no, that's not you, it tends to have a bit of a negative reaction. So is how in your space, and I agree with everything you're saying too, just as an aside, how in your space do you see it evolving to sort of meet this sort of shifting environment? Do you see using different terminology? Is it something that you're wanting to, and you, not just you personally, but your space as a whole, is trying to push back on? Like, how is this going to progress in this sort of new environment?
I think it's like, I mean, it's always hard to say, like, maybe be cautious in the way that you use the word. I mean, that's it's easy for me to say that as I am a curator, but it's also hard to like maybe push back on, contacting the platforms and say, actually, maybe curation isn't the right. I think maybe it's a natural evolvement. Something becomes extremely popular, people talk about it for a really long time, and then all of a sudden, this is not what you do any longer. Like, I mean, I think maybe the case um, of like using Instagram again. I mean, that was very much everyone being a photographer. I'm not sure that is the narrative that we hear any longer. I still think the narrative around everyone being, or everyone can be an artist, is still very much there. Hope that will disappear. I think with curation, I think maybe it will be the same there. I think one thing that is important is to maybe have these conversations and make sure that also our voices are being heard. But also maybe maybe just let it be. Maybe just let some of them have their time, call themselves curators, but also be aware yourself that your job is very different from what they say that they do.
Yeah, I think that might be one way, because ultimately, if there's more people doing or like practicing the like actual action, and your definition was really illuminating for me, because I've never really heard it sort of spelled out in that way, which was really interesting, and like I took a lot from their presentation. It was great.
Thank you.
I wonder if it's like if there's more curators out there, that's a net positive thing. There's more ways of interpreting art. There's more ways of honoring history, etc. And it's more about leaning into those additional aspects beyond just pure arranging collectibles, and just pushing that, like, oh, you say you're a curator, tell me about the history. How do these relate with one another? And like leaning into that almost in a sort of like hidden hand of guided education in a way might be a way forward as well.
Yeah, 100%. I really agree with you. I think that, like, I think anything, like, with majority of the things in life, I think education is key. Like, I think that's, like, if you think about like life in general, education is a great thing. I mean, learning is a great thing, and I think maybe as well, yeah, having conversations, pushing the narratives forward within panels and such as well. I think that is extremely important, reaching a wider audience. So if we're talking about some of the big conferences and such as well, maybe some of the panels is very much should be focusing more of the curation as an act of preserving, reflecting, etc., rather than I don't know, using it as a way of instead of using basically selecting or organizing.
Yeah, almost a like, you say you're a curator. Here's how to curate type of question.
Yeah. maybe
So you
like
say you're a
create some
curator.
kind of like tick box thing, or you say you're a curator.
Yeah.
Well, if you
Okay.
say yes to 10 of these questions, then maybe. But if you say yes to
Yeah.
all of them, then you're definitely a curator.
Yeah. And if you're saying yes to 2, well, here's what you can learn to actually satisfy this.
Yeah, or
we
like
want more of you.
alternative titles.
Yes.
I just shared in our chat a book that I read about this kind of curationism that we experienced in the last couple of years. So I think it's a great way to see this kind of you know more people like calling them their self creators as a like I don't know how to say it, like a new way to do art critique. It's very interesting to see how the connoisseur in contemporary culture changed their name but not their role. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you have this whole narrative as well, like the artist as the curator and the curator as the artist, which as well. I mean, there is like, I was hearing about like about there have been certain things within the NFT space and the Web3 space done by people who's been claimed themselves as curator, which for me is just an absolute no-go. So it was basically an exhibition, I believe, somewhere in the US, where they put pieces up on screens. I didn't see it myself, but I had the story told to me by a person who was there. The person walked into the space and saw that these images that they had on the video screen were actually moving, whereas she approached the curator and said, you got moving NFTs or moving images, that's really interesting. Whereas the curator answered, yeah, they were all static, so I just added this moving element to them. Which, I mean, come on, you can't do that. That's like minimum respect towards the creator, but also I think that straight away just takes away the right to call yourself a curator.
Totally. Do we have other questions or?
Yeah, I'm also curious to hear. I think so. Yeah, first of all, it was really interesting to hear just you going into more detail on what curation really means. It was so yeah, I definitely think there's an educational element that's important. And I guess what I see in this kind of NFT Web3 space is that it's so incredibly driven by the commercial element of it, and so much of the art is derived from the commercialization of it. I'm curious how or I guess I don't know how you propose, or to me the education or having a better understanding of the art itself amongst the buyers would also kind of really sort of make a shift or make a change in the ecosystem overall. So I'm just curious what your take is on kind of the relationship between curator and buyers and curator and galleries.
I mean, I think this is a super interesting question, which I think we're gonna hear more about, especially bias in terms of long-term thinking, like actually investing within an artist in a good way, not like short-term flip kind of scenario, but buying something and waiting to supporting them in terms of building a career that is sustainable and which allows them to have that career for their whole life. I think the relation here for the curator is can work as kind of a guide in terms of discover, but also a guide in terms of maybe understand the pieces from an historical point of view and why they fit in within the narrative now, but also artistic value rather than monetary value, say. And of course, also for galleries, I mean, it really depends on what gallery it is. I mean, even in the commercial art world as well, there are some of them who has an extreme drive in terms of selling, where of course, also you have galleries who are extremely great when it comes to supporting artists in terms of growing their careers as well, and really investing time within the artist. And again, here I think, not always, but in terms of knowing people who works within galleries, even commercial galleries, has quite not often, but sometimes curatorial practice, which maybe allows them to put pieces within an art historical context. So I think, I mean, for me, I think when I did mention this just very briefly, but I think another where all these roles come in is within an ecosystem, which is the art ecosystem. I think it's very easy to just talk about the creator, but don't get me wrong. I mean, we would not exist without the artist or the creator. The art world simply would not work. But there is also a complex system with X amount of roles which are playing a part in how it functions. That is the collector, that is the curator, that is the gallerist, etc. And I think also moving in within Web3, certain roles will move across, not necessarily all of them because it's not fitting, but some of them. So to answer your question, Patrice, I hope this makes sense. I think there is a constant interaction between these roles within the ecosystem, has always been, will always be. The curator is there to maybe create a bit of context and reflection upon how some pieces fits in, but also, to help push artists forward and end up in front of some of the right collectors.
I'm also curious to hear about if there's any specific organizations or I don't know, projects that you find to be doing really interesting curatorial work in the NFT or Web3 space.
I mean, I have sorry, it's a bit of self-promotion. I have to mention Department of Decentralization, which I am part of. I hope this is okay. So, like I said before, like we've been existing within the blockchain world since 2018. I joined in 2019 and have very much positioned ourselves as a translator between art and tech, long-term thinking. How can we create communication between these two communities, which basically, would clash in an extreme way if there is no translation. So DoD definitely. I think vertical crypto is also, as you know, great. Would it be okay for me to just think about it a bit more, and I'll drop some names in the chat here?
Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions? Complete silence. I also just want to say I am also a mentor. So if you want to continue this conversation on the side, or if you have any questions, or if there's anything you want to like run through with me, etc., feel free to reach out to me. Just drop a message here, or reach out to me on Twitter. I think also you should have my email address in the mentor.
I shared your email in the mentor spreadsheet. So yeah.
Perfect.
Okay.
So yeah, if there's anything you guys want to discuss, art tech, curation, bridging between traditional and digital, just hit me up.
I'd love to second Patricia's question around just good examples of curation. I'd love to learn more about this for sure. And so obviously appreciate the thought that you're putting into it. So I can't wait to hear or just see some of the other examples. This has been really, really great.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you so much for your time and for listening to me rambling on about curation. I appreciate that it was so less curation within crypto, but I thought it's just really important to maybe see where it comes from and just have that in consideration as we move forward within the space as well.
And I just was having a thought, and that I just wanted to reflect and see and maybe see what your thoughts are. What I was realizing is also that it seems to me like kind of early NFT or sort of art on the blockchain, the whole, what it was kind of reacting to was the elitism, the exclusion inside of the art, traditional art space itself, and really the idea of celebrating sort of everyone is allowed to be an artist, right? And so then I think it's interesting then when you sort of think about that kind of early ethos that's coming to a point where maybe, it's just not sustainable, doesn't sort of make sense in the long run, or it's just not going to be meaningful in the long run. So then it's like, I really liked your kind of, your positioning on how to make it actually long-term sustainable. I think it's interesting, you are sort of still juggling. I think there's still maybe in the Web3 or NFT space kind of an allergy to the traditional art world and what, some of what that entails, which, so I'm curious if you do have any thoughts on how do you kind of, I guess, bridge sort of the two kind of very different sort of ethos together, because it seems to me like it's neither one of the extremes, but maybe somewhere in the middle. And maybe it goes back to that decentralization. One of the images you had of like, the curators in a decentralized curation.
My own made meme. Yeah, I'm very proud of that one. I think this is super interesting to reflect upon. And I think, funnily enough, I just want to say before we move, before I maybe reflect a bit more upon it, what I find super interesting is that a lot of the systems were created as a reaction against a lot of the problems within the traditional art world, but also another thing that I find super interesting, that if you look at a lot of the platforms and a lot of the things that's happening within the space as well, a lot of it right now is a recreation of what we already have within the traditional art world, but on the blockchain. I don't know if that's a good way forward, but that is the reality. We've gotten to a point where there has been a lot of recreation of that. I think we're also up for some really interesting conversations and tough conversations as we move forward as well within the space. Like what is more important? Like why are we doing this? I don't think necessarily I never sure that I don't have an answer to the like what you were just saying. I think it's extremely hard to bridge and to combine like crypto anarchism and that whole idea behind blockchain, with more commercial platforms. Maybe there's more of a split. I mean, one existing doesn't mean that the other one can't exist or shouldn't exist. Maybe they can coexist together, maybe they can't. If they can, great. If they can't, that's also no problem. But I mean, it's also very important to remember that we are still in an extremely early phase. I mean, the industry is immature, and that's great because we can form it a lot. But thinking around this, conversations around this, I don't think they've happened yet. They might start to bubble to the surface now, but there will be a lot more conversations around maybe how can we combine a commercial effort with an anarchist activism ethos, which basically has fueled a lot of the thinking around what we see now. I hope that was a bit what you were looking for.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Thank you. There's a lot to think about, for sure.
Yeah, agree. I think I 100%. I think we have so much to think about, and I think there's also so much reflection. I mean, this is also one of the reasons why I think reflecting upon history is so important, because, like I said before, I mean, 100%, so many of the problems that we had in the art world, I now see recreated on the blockchain. I don't think that's the way forward, but I also think maybe if we reflect a bit more on history, mistakes, failures, etc., maybe, hopefully, I don't know if this is wishful thinking, maybe we will be able to not recreate as much in the future. I might be a bit too positive, and it might be a bit too much wishful thinking, but I mean, it's always great to know your history. It's always great, and I think it's very vital as we move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think, Stina, that that there will be a new term or role that will replace the curator, the traditional curator that is so linked with the traditional art field, with with all this Web3 revolution, crypto art revolution?
No, I don't think so. I don't actually think so, because I think, or what I hope instead is that there will be maybe a bit more understanding for what a curator could potentially do and what a curator actually does, and that we will not necessarily be seen as gatekeepers, which I know is a bit of the narrative that's being pushed forward. Because I think that is not, I mean, yes, of course, you have gatekeepers and you have bad people, but that's not just because they are curators, that's just because they're bad people. That doesn't have anything to do with the role per se. So no, I don't think it's going anywhere. I think maybe there will be more understanding in terms of what we actually do and the value that we bring to the space.
Amazing. I totally agree, actually. So do we have other question, comment, or I don't know, thoughts?
Hi, I wanted to thank you for that, and I love that it's an open-ended question, that it's not one way or the other. I mean, it's something I feel that it's constantly evolving, and I really loved Claudia's question about how, if the ethos and kind of the crypto art world is where it is because of sort of that it was a free-for-all, right? That anyone could mint, and anyone could, with a Twitter account and an Instagram account, could share their art and make a living and make a life out of it meaningfully. And so it's just interesting to see how that evolves within that ethos that is still really strong.
100%. Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead if I interrupted you.
No, that's just no conclusion, right? It's just this really interesting conversation.
It is. I think, yeah, it's super interesting. And I mean, it's I think this is also one thing is guilty as humans wanting to have an answer. I'm certainly guilty of it. I love to have answers, but some of these roles, I don't think necessarily there is a clear answer. I think maybe saying that there might be better understanding in the future is better than say that there will be an answer in the future. And yeah, again, if there's anything if there's any questions that you think of later, don't hesitate to just ping me or drop me. Yeah, just reach out. I'm here.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Stina, for your time and for this amazing presentation. And yeah, have a good day and see you guys to the next class on Thursday. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much.
I actually I had a quick question. Like, are we? Well, it's just like it's for like I think like just for in general. Like, if we want to reach out to you, do we just like send you an email or do we just tag you in the chat? Which one do you prefer?
I think email is better. I can share my email here as well, or I'll share. I mean, there's Twitter or email is usually the best ones, to be honest.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
And yeah, just reach out.
Yeah, you can find all this information in the pinned message that I shared on our chat. So, yeah.
Yeah, email or Twitter is the absolute best ones, and I promise that yeah, I'll make sure to also check the inbox of from new followers, etc. as well, to make sure that nothing goes miss.
Oh my gosh, I just thought of another question. Is it too late?
Go for it. I'm still here.
Amazing. Perfect. Thank you. We've talked about curators as being this very much separate role in a lot of different ways. But for artists trying to self-market, to almost just communicate what their art is about, do you have any advice, suggestions, places to look around how artists can sort of incorporate curation of other artwork to both communicate what their own art is about, to sort of help elevate the conversation around their art space, their genre, their theme, et cetera, as a whole? How can artists sort of bring a proper practice of curation into their own practice as a means of both self-expression and self-marketing?
I mean, I think you. I mean, you as an artist, you have the knowledge of your art. You created it. I mean, so maybe think about how you would talk about it if a curator would ask X amount of questions, like what inspired you, what was the process, how did you come here, like how does it fit within your wider practice, etc. I'm happy to maybe write down a list of a few questions in terms of what I would normally ask if I have a studio visit with artists and such. Of course, you know, there's a narrative that might be pushed forward, but just to have like maybe 5 questions for you to consider in terms of how, like what I would ask and share here as well, if that's something that could be interesting for you guys.
Yes, that'd be amazing. Actually, that'd be really interesting.
Of course.
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah,
No, I'll do that.
I can guarantee you my art history professors did not do this at all to me, or any of my professors do that to me when I was in university. So that's very appreciated, actually.
No, of course. I mean, I think, I mean, this is one of the beautiful things of Web3, isn't it? That we all help each other.
Exactly. No, this is great. Yeah, a list would be amazing. So glad I caught you before we all ended. Thank you so much.
No, of course. And like I said, if there's any other questions that you think of, I mean, by all means, just reach out and we can set up a mentor session.
Thank you so much for this. This has been really, really great.
Well, thank you so much for having, again, thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for listening to me talking about curation. One of my favorite topics in the world.
All right, thank you. Are we done? Is the
I think so. I mean, if there's no more questions.
I think so.
All right. I'm gonna go outside and Be at the sun. I'm sorry. Canada has not had sun in like 6 months. I gotta be outside. Thank you guys. Y'all have a good one.
Enjoy
Bye.
the sun.
Thanks so much. See you
Take
later.
care, everyone. Thank you. Bye.